Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Morgan here with Arna, and today we're talking to Megan Davis. She's a storyteller who lives in Australia, an artist. She owns her own company, and she focuses on storytelling for innovation and all of the different ways we can think about stories. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah. And what did you think of the conversation, and what stood out to you, Arna?
Yeah, well, it ended actually with me coming up with all these ideas for the podcast. They're like, oh yeah,
That would be so
uh,
cool.
that would be so cool. I think the last thing was we should invite a Bollywood director talking about storytelling because of the different kind of ways in different cultures people use stories and tell stories. And so stories are so fundamental to everything. I think I call it the theory of everything, basically.
Yeah, I think you use that phrase.
Yeah. So that was what it sparked for me because I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I also had a connection light bulb moment where she talks about stories and in connecting people and that also sparked something in me and I was also thinking about the difference of stories because of course we watch TV series or read books or whatever however we consume our stories and not all stories impact me, but then she was saying that the good stories do make an impact, and talking to her of course inspired you. It gave you lots of new ideas. It gave me a light bulb moment, and I think that's maybe going to be my new metric on how I measure a story. Like, did it impact me?
Yeah. And the other thing is that she starts saying that she's an explorer,
Mhm.
and it is something that I mean, for her, it's really specific because she really, she sees herself as an explorer and that varied background because of her kind of storytelling kind of lens. It all makes sense to her, and so that's something that a lot of the people that are on this podcast, not no no no, not a lot of them, all of the people that are on this podcast, they all have a varied background, and in a way, they are all explorers in a way, but most people don't realize it. So they don't look back and say, "Oh yeah, this is what I've learned," and everything kind of it's a circular thing. So her way of thinking about stories is in a circular way. So not a hero's journey, not a beginning, middle, and end, but a circular
Mhm.
uh, event. That to me was also really uh, that's an interesting. That kind of I'll keep thinking about that from now on. Like how is that kind of building, and
Yeah.
how is that story circular? Because you end up at the same place. Anyway, she tells the whole Wizard of Oz story, which is great. So that's good to hear because I was
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, right.
Yeah. There's a
Nice.
lot of great there's a lot of great little moments and stories along the way.
Yeah.
There's a bed blog. Uh
Yeah. Yeah.
the bed
Ah,
blog.
yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't ask, but that reminded me of because it was about 11 years ago or so that she
Mhm.
talked about this, and it reminded me of couch surfing. Do
Yeah.
you remember that? There was this. I think it must have
Yeah.
been the same era somewhat where
No, definitely. Yeah, because I was involved in that as well back then. So
of
yeah.
course you were. Yes.
Love sleeping on strangers' couches.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, you get so many good stories. But
Yeah,
I
couch
think
surfing.
yeah, but mine was more from a position of luxury and curiosity, like, oh, I'm in a new place. Let's see
Hmm.
what interesting people I can meet. Where she became willingly homeless. So that's yeah,
Yeah.
really interesting.
All
So
right. Well, we'll do an episode about couch surfing because I'm curious where did that go? So what happened?
yeah,
What happened
it
there?
still
Why?
exists. I still give them money every year.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Oh,
we'll explore in another podcast, but
oh, I didn't know that. Okay. All right. Let's listen to Megan Davis.
yeah, enjoy.
I think fundamentally I'm an explorer. So I'm interested in everything. And it's often been hard for me to be like, I'm this and I'm only this and I'm only interested in this thing, because my background has been pretty varied and the stuff that I'm interested in now and in the future is also like where I see myself going is pretty varied. So, and I've, was born in the US and I live in Australia now, and I travel as much as I possibly can. It's hard getting off this island, I have to say. So that does sometimes cramp my plans. But yeah, fundamentally, I think I'm an explorer, and I'm interested in uncharted territories and what's next and what we can't see. I think like most explorers are. We're not interested in what's very tangible. We're interested in the intangible, or the thing that's around the corner, or what might surprise us. We're interested in what we don't know as opposed to what we do know, I think.
Maybe think, sorry, when you said we're interested in what's around the corner, I'm always I annoy my family when we are traveling, for instance, and then we're walking, like we're in a new town, and they'll go like, "Come, go back. We'll have ice cream." And we're like, "Yeah, but wait, I want to see what's around the corner. Just want to go this street. Yeah, what would be here? What would be there?" So that's really, so I'm like, when I'm alone and I'm traveling, I keep walking. I go like, what's here? So literally, anyway, for me, I take that. Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to ask you something about your varied background and future. It's not interesting. How can you walk us through those?
Yeah, the many steps that have brought me here. So when I was in I guess elementary school and high school, all I did was act and sing, and I was very arty, and that was pretty much what I spent most of my day doing. So I had my classes I had to take because I was college prep, and you have to take this much science and this much math and all that stuff. But every chance I got, I was singing or acting, and I could do that for 2 to 3 hours and get credits for it during the day. But then I also did it in the evening, as part of extracurricular activities. And then I went to university and I started studying religion. So what I was studying was comparative religion. So it's a sociological degree, not a theological degree. Right. And you look at different times and places and what people believed, and you look at the intersections of those beliefs, but also what's different. And you could compare anything from someone who lived in the Indus River Valley in India 3,000 years ago to someone who lives, like a Protestant in upper New York State in the US, for example, and look at those belief systems to understand what's the same, what's different, what it means for culture, society, for how we see our worlds. And it's interesting as well, because that's where I really started first dissecting storytelling. So you could say the acting as well, yes. But for me, that was a lot more about character development, because the story, I wasn't in control of the story. The story was written and I was thrown into the story, and I had to, make sense of it as with my body and my expressions. And, but dissecting of story and understanding what survives and what doesn't, what resonates and what doesn't, what continues to make sense and what starts losing relevance, is you start seeing, similarities, and you start seeing things that are really strong, and you start understanding what is catchy, or what is how you remember things, or how they transform. That's the most important thing. So we tend to think about culture as being quite static, when in fact it moves at a rapid, furious pace. It continues, right? It runs and runs and runs. And we think about ancient culture, for example, we think, well, it was the same, there's like 1,000 years and it was kind of the same. Not really, right? It changed rapidly. Maybe not to the degree that we think of rapid now, but for the time and place, for them, it did feel really fast. So
but when did you start it? When was the moment that you kind of sort of, if you, for lack of a better word, but when did you frame it as storytelling or story? When was that? Yeah. When you go like, it's all about stories, because because it's very, probably in hindsight, and when we're listening to you, it's all clear. Like, yeah, oh, that's where where stories come from. Of course. But when you're in the middle of it and you're studying religious or belief systems and religions, and when's the moment you go like, oh, actually, that's the big kind of connector, or was that part of what you were studying?
Yeah.
Did they frame it as storytelling as well, or was it no?
No, they didn't. So, there was story. So there was myth and there was folklore, right? So we talked about story, and Joseph Campbell, of course, comes up over and over again. But as it being a study of story, no, that was never explicit. And it wasn't until I actually dropped out of a master's degree because I decided I didn't want to be an academic. And it wasn't until kind of 10 years after leaving that form of study that I started realizing that I could apply it to, at the time I was working as a designer, as a graphic designer. And I started thinking about, how shape and form and all these things come together to create a story of some kind for people to interpret or interact with. But it was then that I started thinking about, my background in acting and my background in, studying culture, which is fundamentally the study of stories, that I started understanding that I saw story in a different way than a lot of other people did. Because a lot of people would say, well, it's a story, it's a beginning, middle, and an end. And I was like, well, but some don't. And in fact, the more they don't end, the better they are, because they transform or they're open-ended. And you just run with it and think, well, what else can we do with this? Or what else could this possibly mean? How many times could I interpret the same Shakespearean sonnet, for example, right? The more that it's interpretable, the more that it's flexible, the more that we can incorporate it into something that's happening for us in a moment, the more likely that story is to survive. So I realized a long way after, and there wasn't a moment that I can recall where I thought, there was no like Newton's apple hits him on the head and he's like, oh, I just figured out a thing. It was it was very gradual, where I started just through multiple conversations, just thought, wait a second, I see story something very different. And it was because of this study that I did.
And when you talk, I'm from the United States as well, and also have an interest in how religion shapes culture and culture, everything is connected. But when you say that you studied then comparative religions, I'm trying to tell myself some story about you and your life and your upbringing. And my assumption is either came from a very religious background or a very liberal and open background. And I'm curious if that's if the story that I'm telling myself has any truth to it, or if I'm just bad at telling myself stories.
Yeah, so kind of half. So I think my mom was kind of religious, not overly, but she was raised Catholic, and she really wanted me to be Catholic, and took me to Sunday school. And I did the first communion, and I was going through the confirmations process, so I was doing that study until I got into an argument with a nun and got kicked out of class. And then I just told my mom, I'm not going back. I was like, I'm done. That's it. I'm not going back. And she really tried to push me to go, and I just wouldn't. And then my dad, when she told him, she said, well, just wait till I tell your father. And I said, okay. So she tells him that I got into a fight with a nun and I wasn't going back to, to catechism. He just said, did you really do that? And I said, yeah. And he was like, that's awesome.
Can you tell me what the fight was about?
Okay, sure. So,
because I don't know, the story is not complete without that kind of.
I'm just imagining you going fist to fist with a nun right now.
Yeah.
And going, oh, you.
Luckily, didn't get physical, so but wasn't that terrible of a child. But I was 12 years old, sitting in class, and we were talking about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And so she was talking about how Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then that caused the downfall of man. And so I was like, what? So I raised my hand. I was like, wait a second, I just have a question.
You're the first person in history who says, what?
Yeah.
Like,
I was definitely the only person in the class who found that, a problem with the statement. So,
really?
yeah,
Like no one else was like, what's going on?
no,
Everyone's like, yeah, that makes sense. That
Yeah,
explains everything.
right.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, well, they might have been thinking it, but they didn't say it, right? But I was the only person who was just like, wait a second. And so I said, so you're saying that women are the fundamental problem with society, like we cause the downfall of everything? And she said, yes. And I was like, oh. I was like,
She
right,
said
okay.
yes.
She said yes. She just said, yep. And she said, it's in the Bible. And I said, no. I just said, no, I don't buy that. I don't think women are the cause of evil. And she
Wait
said,
a
no.
minute.
Yeah. And she started getting angry. And she said,
God.
but that's what God said.
And proved her point right there.
Right.
Sorry.
That's it. Yeah.
I will show you what really she got angry with you and then
Yeah. I kept questioning her. So I can't remember the exact, I don't remember exact level of, how far this went, but I do know that, she kept pushing back on me that this is in the Bible. This is what it says. And it was this very literal approach. And then I kept saying, no, that doesn't actually explain the concept of evil. It doesn't explain why bad things happen in the world. And it certainly can't be the fault of one gender or, it's just impossible. There's no way that this is a valid story and it doesn't prove anything. And I was just like, no, I don't accept it. So she kicked me out of the room and I had to go sit in the hallway. And she said, I'll call your mother. I'm going to tell her what happened. I was like, okay. So, I wasn't really that worried about it. So yeah, so that's how that story that's how that story went. And so then I never went back after that point. I wasn't particularly interested in anything that had to do with any of that. So yeah, but yeah, I think there was a lot of religious upbringing, I guess, and lots of talk about religion. And like my grandma, my dad's mother lived across the road. We lived on a farm together. So it was a family farm. So we all lived on the farm. She lived across the road and she had a lot of very pointed ideas about religion. And I didn't necessarily agree with her either. So I don't really know where my very independent stance came amongst all of that, but it just, I always kind of had my own mind and my own way of thinking, or definitely my own way of questioning things. And I think I was surprised that she reacted the way she did, because I thought I was having, like a discussion. I thought I was able to question things. I thought that was allowed, but no, apparently it's not.
I've been on the other side of big religious questions as well, and yeah, I like that your dad supported you.
Yeah. In like a very offhand, like he kind of closed the subject. He didn't really ever talk about it again, but he really left it to me to fight my battle on my own. But he just said,
with
yeah,
the nuns.
cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Fighting the nuns. Yeah. Oh, that's amazing.
So then what? I was going to ask then what drove you to study comparative religion, because that's a very niche. Well, I'm thinking of myself coming out of high school, right? And it seems like a very niche study.
And after fighting the nuns,
yeah,
you go like, let's not go. Did that have any connection or with that experience or
yeah. I mean, yes, it did, but it wasn't a it wasn't a driver. Like that was definitely a very foundational moment in my life that, drew some lines for me in terms of who I am and what I think about various things. But I think that there was this course that I did when I was in high school. So we could sign up for advanced studies if we could find a teacher who would teach us. And so I signed up for advanced American Lit, and it was one-on-one. No one else wanted to do the class. It was just me. And a lot of the stuff we read was written in the 60s, 70s, and some into the 80s. But that was a time when in American literature, it was heavily spiritual, right? So we were reading like Ken Kesey and Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and I can't remember the author, but these are highly spiritual books, and a lot of them had kind of Christian and Buddhist and like all these different religious kind of, without adhering to one in particular, but it had all these various belief systems kind of underpinning the philosophies that were coming through,
right?
Or refuting it. Like Kesey definitely was his own. He wasn't particularly adhering to anything, but he also had pretty strong philosophies that were definitely underpinned by major, religious belief systems. So it was a lot of discussion about religion. And so then I started thinking about culture, right? So these stories were foundational in this transformation period of the 50s into, I guess, what's considered the very modern age of what we think of like the American novel, right? So things from like the 80s onwards, there was a very different kind of shift, but there was that massive transition in those 30 years after the war, the way that writing shifted in America. So I was looking at these stories, and then I took an elective that everyone had to have some sort of elective in the humanities. And I chose a religion class, and I think it was World Religion 101. And so we were talking about all these different religions from all over the world. And we were talking a lot about Joseph Campbell and, these kind of, voices that we're constantly hearing about culture and religion. And I got really fascinated by it. So I started talking to the professors who taught it. And I was like, what do you guys do? Like, what's your job? Like, how do you teach this stuff? How do you study this stuff? And then the more involved I got, the more I realized that I was fascinated with it. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. So at first it was like a minor. But then once I got into the programs, they kept pushing me to do a major. So, and then they were pushing me to do my master's. And I think, it was one of those things where they thought, oh, here's a really great addition to the department. We like the way this person thinks, or they agree with what we teach or our standpoint on these things, whatever it is. But then I was just like, no, I want to be an artist. And I dropped my master's program. So, yeah. Which I didn't become, by the way, but that was the thinking.
So what was tell us more about that thinking of, I want to be an artist? Because that's I think that's an interesting question or thought that, I think also Morgan and I had, many times. I want to be an artist. I still do, by the way. It's still a thing.
Yeah.
But what sparked that thought, and what was that in your mind? What kind of artist? What was that about? Yeah.
So I was fascinated by photography. I loved photography. I was taking little courses, like at the community college. So not at the university, state level university I was at, but there was community college, which you could do. And I was shooting for myself, and I was like, there's something about this form that I really love. And I liked the way that I could structure worlds and make stories, basically, because I wasn't like a straight photographer. I didn't like candid shots. I liked setting up shots, and I liked creating worlds, and I liked, lighting them in studios. So it was very much like a lot of them had kind of fairy tale aspects to them. They involved fairy tale characters dressing people up or making making little mannequin kind of things that I could pose, and backdrops that I drew. So it was the medium that I was using to capture the stories was a camera. And so yeah, I really loved it. And so I thought, there's all these things I'm studying and I'm really fascinated with it. And I started kind of trying to produce these stories, these like this folklore or this myth or these stories about culture and these images. And I thought, okay, I love this. This is what I love. Like, I'm not an academic. I don't want to sit and watch people and think about stuff and write stuff and like dig through ancient Sanskrit and try to learn that language, or ancient Greek, or all these dead kind of languages. Like I want my hands dirty. I want to be amongst people. I want to make things. I want to create, and that really inspired me. And then I was thinking, but I also want something that's really practical. So maybe I'll become a designer. Maybe I'll become a graphic designer. So what ended up happening is I've met, so my ex is Australian. That's why I moved here. We're not together anymore, but I came here to be with him. And then I studied photography at RMIT here. Through that process of studying photography, I started shooting a little bit, but then design work kept coming up at the same time. So it's like, we need people to shoot these shoes and then lay them out. Right. So then I started transitioning into magazine layout, and I was doing photo retouching and calibrating machines. So machines printed, because all that technology, it runs the same way. Calibrating a screen is the same as calibrating printers. And this is a while ago, so I know the technology is very different, but back then there was quite a bit of manual kind of tinkering. I started doing that, and then this is really funny. I quit my job and became homeless and was traveling the world because, again, I wanted to become an artist. So it all came full circle.
Sorry,
so
go back a bit. You became homeless? Sorry.
Yeah, I chose to become homeless.
You chose to become, tell me.
Yeah. So I became houseless in terms of, I always had a home to sleep in. It just wasn't mine. And so I had a job, and I quit, and I went back to the US and to see my family. And then I journeyed on to Europe, and I have family that was living there at the time and friends there. And I was traveling around there. Then I came back to Australia. And when I came back here, I really didn't have anywhere to go. So I had a friend renovating her apartment, and I just was like, hey, can I live with you and help you renovate? And then, when you're ready, I'll find somewhere else to go. And so she was like, sure. So I helped her like smashed out her kitchen and her bathroom and everything. And during that time, I had this blog I called the Bed Blog. And the bed blog was, I took a photo of the bed I slept in that night and posted it on this blog. And the blog was connected to Twitter and Facebook. This was 11 years ago. Almost 12, when it was a very different platform. Anyone could pretty much see anything you posted. Yeah. And so people were following along and commenting like, don't give up, keep going. And, oh, do you need somewhere to stay? You can house sit for me. Or do you need a job? I need someone to design a poster, or I need someone to do yard work. Or do you want to come over and have dinner? Do you need something to eat? So everything I needed came to me. And then in the meantime, I was building an art practice, and I had gallery openings, and I was sitting galleries and had work up on the wall, and it was still photography, and it was still these worlds I was creating. But it was getting to the point where I was like, okay, I'm going to get kicked out of the last place I'm in. They want me to go. I really want to move in somewhere else, like, and pay rent and, live like kind of a more normal life, because it's very exhausting living that way. And it was almost a year. So nerves were frayed, and my gallery show was ending, and my place where I was staying was ending. And so I reached out to a person I used to work for and said, hey, I've learned all this stuff about telling stories online, like social media, which Facebook's really new. Do you guys want anything like that where you're at this business? Do you think you need help with like communicating online? And he said yes. So then I started. He was my first client, basically, with the business that I have now. And so I learned everything by trying to become an artist and telling stories online. And then I accidentally started a business, which I am doing now almost 12 years later. So
It's like the hero's journey.
Yeah. Kind of. Yeah, in a way, a little bit. Yeah.
A little bit, or like Kurt Vonnegut's. I don't know if you've seen his video online. Man in Hole, he calls that.
Yeah.
You
I
know?
love Vonnegut.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, it is actually interesting because, and if you listening to you, that especially, I mean, obviously the fight with the nun is like this iconic moment in the movie of your life, which I actually I'm seeing now in my head. Like this is like that's such a great scene, right? But it is so. But if I think about it, you're kind of you're challenging. Both kind of saying no. Stories are it's not about because you. So basically, what you said to the nun is like you don't understand the story. That's not what the story is about. That's not what story is. And on the other hand is like, and it's about questions. It's about asking questions, and so that is, I think that stayed with you all the time, asking questions. And so it's not only stories; it is about asking questions and uncovering. And that this is where when you started saying you're an explorer, right? So it's exploring, but in a lot of so I think that's what you're saying, right? When you say you see stories different, because if I think about it, for a lot of people, stories are just stories, and it's nice. It might be might be some information in it, and there might be it's entertaining, but it's not about questions. That's for a lot of people. That's actually not what it's about. Stories are about answers.
Yeah.
It's more about no, this is the story. It's not. It shouldn't lead to questions, but it might also be a difference between sort of. Again, I haven't studied storytelling that much, but there is a difference between cultures, right? So, I mean, Eastern cultures have more open-ended stories, or Asian stories will have endings where you have to figure it out yourself. Like these are the elements, and you tell the story in your head how it might end. And whereas in Western cultures, there's a end to it, and usually a happy end, unless it's Scandinavian, because then it's all doom and gloom and terrible and everybody dies. But or at least everyone, it happens, or they're like, depressed or something really bad and dark happens. But especially, obviously, the Hollywood storytelling, but a lot of the Western storytelling is about happy ends, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
But there's a difference between these different cultures. So has that influenced you as well when you started, studying kind of these different cultures and different ways of stories? Did that influence you?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, like as soon as when I teach storytelling, I go in and say we, in the West, we have a tradition of a story being a straight line, or a line that goes up to like some sort of peak and then it curves down again. And then I tell them, let's just forget about that. We're not doing that today. And then I also specifically do not teach the hero's journey because there's a lot of problems with that framework in terms of it is one Western white man's view of stories from all over the world. It's like, oh, it just fits this. And it's like, well, do they? Does it? No. In Joseph Campbell, I had to really kill a few darlings when I really had to start dissecting that and say, okay, yeah, I'm not going to teach that, and I'm not going to talk about it. And if I do, it's with a lot of caveats, because there's a lot of problematic thinking that goes into that framework. But yes, definitely, like stories. I talk about storytelling as a cycle, and they always move in circles. And everything moves in circles. Like life is cycles, and nature is cycles, and some of the most natural shapes are circles. Where we find repeated over and over again. And so stories for me are a circle, and they always begin and end in the same place. So if you have a main protagonist, a story that's being told through a particular point of view, that person is still the same person. They've just had a bunch of experiences that's changed them in some way. So it's changed maybe where they live, or their position in society, or maybe they go from being single to being married, or if it's like a love story, but they're still them, right? But it's just something about their point of view has changed. And it's that journey that you go on with them that teaches you something, or you experience something with them. So for me, stories are a cycle, a circular experience. And they also, most stories tell you in the very beginning what it's about, but it's not until you come back to the end, which is also usually still the beginning, that meaning changes for you. So my favorite way of explaining this is the Wizard of Oz. And because I talk to people all over the world, I've had to find a thing. What has everyone heard of? And surprisingly, the Wizard of Oz is it's you can kind of be in a room and say, who here has heard of this movie, The Wizard of Oz? 90% of the people there will raise their hand. It's really interesting. But Dorothy wakes up one morning and says, there's no place like home. It's so boring. I want to go somewhere else, somewhere over the rainbow. So she's talking about home, home, home. I hate it, sick of it. Blech. It's black and white. It's so dull. So she's talking about home, and there's no place like home in a really negative way. Then she gets whisked away to the land of Oz. And the moment she lands, she says, I have to go home. How do I get home? And they say, follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City. And, the great and powerful Wizard of Oz will tell you. He'll tell you how to get home. He knows everything. And she's like, great. And then she goes on this journey, and she meets all these people. She learns all these things about herself and about what she wants from life. She gets to the wizard and she says, I want to go home. And he's like, look, I'm not really a wizard. I don't know what I'm doing, And she's like, what? And she's like, but how do I get home? And he said, you've always known how to go home. The power's always been with you. And then the good witch comes in and says, you just click your heels together 3 times. You say, there's no place like home. And then she goes home. So she's right back where she started, but her perception of home changes. So it's in color, and she looks around and she sees everything that she has there. And it's actually just as magical as Oz, right? But she's changed on that journey. And in fact, the reality is she's been in like a coma or something, or they don't really say what happens to her, but she's unconscious for an extended period of time, and she wakes up again. So she's actually never even left. But that's the way stories really, for me, work, is that it's this exploration of some moment that's picked out, and then this character goes on a journey exploring that moment, and they're going all over the place. But then they revisit that same point in time, or thinking, or emotional question, whatever it is, and then they go, oh, and they have this epiphany, and then you're like, oh, amazing. And then you have that journey with them, and you learn something new about yourself and about the world and about this character. But you've never left, Yeah. You're still sitting there in front of the screen watching the TV. Nothing's changed for you except your point of view, or what you know or don't know at that time.
Well, and yeah, I think that's really, really, really cool. Because the main character might, Dorothy might be back in the same place, home, but for her, it's a different place.
Yes.
Because, right. So everything actually changed, but nothing changed. But their perception just, in her mind, it changed. There's a little piece of a poem in Amsterdam underneath the bridge. So Morgan, if you go to the train station in Amsterdam, there's you can go underneath this road next to a canal. Anyway, there's
I know.
So it says, I can't translate it exactly, but it says, staying is not the same as returning. And it means, so it was actually in a place where people would go off with their ships and conquer places and kill people and stuff and steal their whatever gold. That's basically in Amsterdam. That's how we build Amsterdam. Sorry, that's a different story. But this idea of you travel. So these are the travelers that go, and the idea that you stay either. So you have there's 2 people, brothers, sisters. One stays, one leaves and travels the world, comes back. They don't live in the same place anymore. because they, traveling will, change, the way you view where you came from. So literally, it's what happens. A friend of mine, Union, her son is on a ship now. Basically, it's like there's teachers and there's the whole school comes with them, but they're on this boat, this ship, and they've sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and for months. And he's studying math at the same time, which is amazing to me. Like, how can you? But still, so I asked her, so when he comes back, he's going to be a different kid, right?
Yeah.
So it's different. So it's in a way a lot of Wizard of Oz and like a lot of these stories, they do reflect things that we go through, right? So in that sense, these stories are, I'm not sure if they're metaphors, but a lot of them are metaphors, but they are about life. So that's, I think, why they also resonate so, and maybe even more than stories that are, in that sense, not circular, because they might be entertaining, but they don't really kind of resonate. So I'm not sure if that's true, if stories like that stay with us longer or not. But to me, it's really cool to be able to see sort of stories in your life as well, that as stories, if you know what I mean. So if not somewhere like, oh yeah, that happened, because like, no, these are all kind of stories. You changed, something happened to you, and then and this is why I was really interested in like things like origin stories. Like so if I coach people, for instance, I always want to hear their origin story, and lots of times people go like, yeah, right, my parent, this is why I do this now. And I think it also might, it's also about reflecting on where you come from. I mean, when you're younger, you might not be able to. When you're, as a teenager, you might not be able to. I don't know, maybe that happens in your 20s or 30s or something, that you get easier for you to reflect on where you're from and your parents. But it is such a, I don't know, if you understand your origin story, you understand more about yourself. And it is all about that journey in the sense, which you just described. That's what, somewhere we all go through these kind of, we all go down the rabbit hole, right? Reference another story, which is the same, right? So I think so it's not just about storytelling, but it's so, because if you talk about storytelling, it sounds, for a lot of people, it's like, oh, that's really nice. It's such a separate thing from life, but actually, no, it's not. It's right there. It's you. And I think, and I'm looking. So I have to tell you, I actually, because I have a screen here, and I have your LinkedIn page up, and it says "Become a Story." So I'm like, that's right. So you become a story because you become aware of the fact that you're a story. You are the story.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, because you are only a collection of your stories. A eulogy isn't a list of statistics. A eulogy.
That'd be cool, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be interesting.
Spreadsheet. Yeah. The spreadsheet sheet of your life.
Yeah. You're just like all the critical stats. But there are stats in there, right? Like maybe how long you've lived, or where you've lived, or if you've got children or a spouse or something like that. But it's, the stats are conveyed through a story, through the contextualization of a story. And it'll have, like your points of view, or what you believed in, or what causes you were engaged in, and what impact you left on the world. That's your story. It's your legacy. So, and your all cultures have their stories, and that's what keeps them a unique culture, and not just at a, national level. For example, we all have origin stories about how did you meet your spouse or your partner or whoever you're, dating at the moment. People love those stories. How did you meet? And that's like part of your culture as a couple. And you have like your unique language or your in-jokes, and sometimes you forget and you say like their pet name in front of other people, and they're like, don't call me that. other people, but it's like all those aspects, those little stories, the name on its own doesn't make any sense to anyone but you, but if they hear the story, it might, right? So stories are what create culture and culture happens regardless, right? And it's like unconscious thing, but if you want to become conscious about it, you become aware of the stories and you start telling the right ones to move with culture in the right way. And we see this played out, especially in the political arena, but like if we're talking about organizational culture, for example, we're doing like strategic narratives that is about putting forward what are the stories that exemplify the culture and the vision that we want to bring into being, right? So that's that intentionality.
And it's and I can't, like, I just had the Newtonian light bulb moment because I did. So I'm really interested and fascinated about death and end of life and how we approach that as a species, as a culture, as people. And because it's one of the great universal connectors. It's something, no matter what century you were born in or where you were born, it's something we all have to deal with. And it's quite an experience. And so I did a lot of research around memorialization and how we memorialize and how we remember those that we've loved and that we've lost. And I found one thing is, of course, people are very uncomfortable to speak about it in Western societies. And I was specifically looking at the United States, and people don't want to talk about it. It becomes this heavy thing. They don't want to remind people that they're grieving. The outsiders don't want to directly ask about it because they don't want to bring up perhaps a painful topic. And so there becomes this kind of like elephant in the room. And I found, okay, what is the one thing that they really want or need to memorialize even better? And the thing is to share stories. So it's not always just recognizing, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, but, oh, what was one of your favorite memories? Or, oh, do you have a favorite story with this person? And when you can create that space for stories, it just completely transformed and changed because people were excited to listen to a nice story. People were so pleased and loved sharing this story about someone that they love. And it really became this magical moment in space to connect with each other as well. And of course, I thought it was this great insight about, memorialization and end of life, but then you're also talking about the story thread of it, which reminded me of this. And I think it's also such a powerful tool for connection. Of course, political dynasties use this as well, but I think that's one of the really beautiful things about stories is connection. And I just had that light bulb moment. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, glad I could help unintentionally, but yeah. It's fascinating once you become conscious, right? Of, well, how did stories work in that context, or what did that story do? Or, I have like a suite of intentional stories that I tell because I know that I tell this story because I want to convey this piece of information or create this level of understanding or create this type of connection with someone. So once you have that kind of awareness, it never goes away, right? And when I talk about story, when I do story training, I always use the term story thinking because I teach people to think about storytelling. I won't teach you how to tell the perfect story because that's impossible. It doesn't happen. Story is a lifelong learning pursuit. There's no like famous director who's like, well, I've won one Oscar and I'm not going to direct any other films. I've done it all. I've learned everything and I've told the perfect story. It doesn't work that way. So it's this awareness. And once you have like your story vision on what you can see and understand and start playing with, it just opens so many doors for you. There's no limits.
Like story thinking.
Mm.
I do have a thought about something you said earlier that might be related to this. You said the writing, you see through history writing changes, right? You talked about the 60s and the 70s, and then the writing changes. But I was thinking, does the writing change, or does because in my mind there's always so many people who write but only a few will emerge because they are accepted by publishers or by the readers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's also about the stories we like to listen to, or we. So it's you know what I'm saying? Is it
Yeah.
it's like, the people who emerge are not the only people who write. Right. So there's lots of people who, who might write amazing, in the 70s, probably there must be a million stories you've never heard of that are amazing, but they were never published. Like musicians, right? There's a musician on the corner of the street and he's like this amazing musician, but, they'll never make it because of, whatever reason, culture, or, that's just not the thing that we publish right now or stuff like that. So is there also, how would that work for you? I mean, because the culture is, it's all these things added together. And then it also accepts certain stories. Like, we find it difficult to accept stories with an open end because we don't like that, because it leaves us like, yeah, but I want to know what happened. So, at my home, when we watch a movie that has an open ending and there's no conclusion, we go like, is this a series? Is there like a part 2? Like, that leaves me, it doesn't satisfy.
Yeah.
Right? And we want that because we live in a world, at least in the West, where we want to be satisfied. We want to go, oh, yes, I want to have my dessert as well. You go like, but when it's not, you're like, and we don't like that because it's not part, because we haven't, in a way, it's way more interesting to leave people like that. It's way more interesting because but you don't know, you don't have the ability, or you don't understand, nobody taught you that is, that's the fun part of the story, where it leaves you and you go like, what happened? So does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah. I think my response is just write or record or do whatever it is you need to do to get the story into the world, because we're constantly finding genius that wasn't recognized at its time because it was too far ahead, or sometimes maybe it was too far in the past.
That's too late. That's too, like Van Gogh, for instance, like people like that. There's like, that's too late. That's like now you like the art. Now, it's like now we discover, But it's true. Obviously, you're right. I mean, sure. I mean, there's people, way before their time. I mean, we discover new scientists, new people who actually were fundamental to something. You're like, did you know actually that person was the one? And we're like, oh. But that's 100 years ago. They're gone. Now they don't get that recognition. Or maybe that's also part of our culture, that we feel like we need the recognition now.
Yes.
It's part of we want to be satisfied now. So not like, we don't want to have this feeling that we actually did something that has impact and will be recognized later. That's not good enough. But then maybe that's also our short-term kind of the way we're brought up and taught. Like we need our success now.
That's 100%. Yeah, it's 100% cultural for sure. In terms of, I did this, I said that, and I want recognition.
Yeah,
100%. But I think in particular, when we're talking about representation in terms of diversity, diverse voices, that there's a lot of problematic thinking that have excluded people in the past. So, finding out about women writers, women poets, women artists, across in any culture. It doesn't matter what culture we're talking about, but women are constantly being discovered, and some of them were really, really popular, and in fact massive voices at their time, but they were disappeared after the fact because they didn't fit into like a white Western male canon, for example. So they were popular and were recognized at their time, and they were just forgotten, and the world moved on. But but because they did write, because they were there, because they are documented, they existed, and their work still exists in some way. they're back. And it's hard to think about the people who, especially like women who contributed a lot to science that were never recognized and are starting to be now.
It's still happening. It's still
It's
happening.
still,
I mean, I
it
just read this thing on LinkedIn that said listed the women that were actually responsible for the whole emergence of AI, of all the the women that actually were and not the the Elon Musks
yes.
of the guy those guys that kind of always take the limelight, where actually there are also all these women that are actually fundamental to all these developments. And we still need, although it's really current, but still we need to kind of be made aware of it, like so that's also it's still you're still fighting the nun in that sense.
For sure.
Yeah,
For sure.
Isn't that
Yeah.
weird?
But even if you feel like you don't have a voice, don't allow yourself to become voiceless. Still write, still sing, still produce, because the fact that you're doing it is the most important thing. Because you're not silenced. You still have a voice, and like I just can't encourage that enough. And not just for women or voices that are marginalized, for anyone. I'm talking about any person who has something inside them. Produce it, because you never know. Because when I talk about storytelling and especially in the innovation context, so like with design teams, I always stress this over and over again. It's we, not me. It's we, not me. Your story is one of an infinite amount in terms of the amount of people that have lived on this planet and the people that will potentially come after. So, but you're contributing to a bigger landscape. And while you might think, well, who would care about my story? You don't know. And that's part of the mystery. Because someone does always care about your story, because your friend calls you up and says, how are you doing? They want to hear what stories you have, what's going on in your life. And you just don't know what one story can do. You don't understand the kind of tsunami like power it can have or a snowball like becoming an avalanche. You don't know until you put it out there. But I think a lot of people get discouraged because they don't feel like that anyone would care, but also some people are discouraged because they actually have a battle to fight to be heard. And that's really hard, and I can't. And while I do understand, there's also battles that I understand that I won't understand. And I don't understand how scary or painful or even dangerous it can be for some people to actually tell their story. But, that for me, that's like, if that's what you have to do as like an ultimate act of rebellion, then do it. Because you just don't know.
And because I'm also thinking you talked about you wanted to be an artist. So you also have spent time thinking about the art of creation and making things and bringing them to life. What is it like when you have a story? Like, are you inside of you and you don't do something with it? Like, or are you so now comfortable telling stories that you're like, oh, okay, here's something here. Let me create that space for it to flourish.
Yeah. So I guess maybe it's like an adjacent question. It's like the politicians answer the question you wish you'd been asked and you have been asked, but I promise it'll come together. So at the end of last year, I decided that I was going to start acting again. And so I've auditioned exactly twice, and I've been cast exactly 2 times. So that is very high success rate. Like, that is not normal. That doesn't happen. So I've just taken as a good sign that I'm supposed to start acting again, because I got cast twice and I auditioned twice. So, and for whatever reason, it felt really like, even though I'd spent so much time doing it, it felt really hard to give myself permission to do it again. And I was just like, no, I'm going to do it. This is what I want to do. And it's something that I don't know where it's going to go, and I have no idea where it will take me, but I feel like this is somehow the next step in my life, or like where I'm supposed to evolve to. And so, and like acting is, like I was talking about, comparative religion, acting is incredibly foundational to what I do. And I've now like I actually teach acting to like designers, you know, like how do we act, you know, how do we actually act through personas or roles? Like, you know, here's some actual skills that actors use, you know, because I've seen with what I do that that's what I was doing anyways. So now I've like learned, okay, you know, but then there's this other side of me that it's like, I have to take this all deeper because it's like any kind of storytelling or creativity. There's no end. You just go deeper and deeper and deeper until, you know, you die, basically. You don't stop becoming, you're not like, now I'm an actor and I've retired. You don't. You're an actor and then you die. So, because it's like a calling, it's not a job. So, yeah. So in terms of, you know, storytelling and getting those stories out of you, I think the biggest question people have to ask is in what way does the story need to come out? And like Arne, you're saying, I'm not a writer, writing anything I can do to not write. Perfect. Great. You know? So I've got a podcast. And so that's where you're learning, you know, this is where I add value, but this is also where I get the story out of me. And Morgan, you're here because you obviously love stories and you love having conversations and asking deep questions, and you get to do that. And so that's why you're here, to get those stories, you know, out of the other person, but also out of yourself, right? Because you were having connection moments while we were talking, like, oh yeah, I thought of this, and I thought about, you know, these conversations around death and memorialization. So yeah, it's anything you do is the thing to do, and you'll know because you really want to do it. You know, don't write a book if you really don't want to write a book. I mean, writing books are horrible.
I knew it.
But it's a grueling thing, writing. It really is, you know, like you can understand why there was a lot of writers that had substance abuse problems. I completely understand, because the writing is really hard and it's awful. A lot of it is awful. And, you know, I don't like writing. I don't like the act of writing. I like having written. I like reading what I've written after it's done.
Yeah.
The act of doing it, I'm just like, oh, this is so hard.
But isn't that part of being, so in a way, so I actually do see myself as an artist, and Morgan and I talked about this a lot, actually, about if you say I'm an artist, there's this weird thing where you go like, I don't deserve to say that, because, you know, that sounds very, as if it's a lofty thing, which is not, because most artists are poor and are starving. You know, it's not but it's like this, you know, you have to earn that in some weird way. But art, to me, and I grew up in a family with artists, and but to me, art is part of that, is also suffering. It sounds, it might be maybe a big word for it, but there is a suffering to it, because so if I paint, if I paint, it's terrible. It's the same. I have dyslexia, so writing, that makes sense to me, that it's hard for me to write because of my dyslexia. But painting, I can actually do, but I find it really terrible, because I feel like I'm failing all the time. I don't know what I'm doing. It's like horrible, and it doesn't work, and it's like no. But, you know, and then when it's done, I'm kind of happy, but then I can do better. So there's this continuous kind of, I don't know, it's not to me, it's not like a positive thing at all. It's not like, yay, I'm painting, yay, but I need to create. So it's not just with painting. I need to create. I just need to create something. Whether it's, I play music, I've been on stage, I've done comedy, actually. And whatever it is, I don't care. It's all, to me, it's all the same. As long as I create, even in my business, it's the same thing. I need to create something, and so I don't think I've ever. I mean, it's only the last few years that I kind of frame it as stories, but it is sort of stories that, to me. So when you talk about acting, for instance, to me, acting it's just, you know, how you go through life. It's like I have these different personas. I go like, now I'm a painter. Now I'm a photographer. My first job was photographer. So now I'm a photographer, right? And that's, I even have different jackets, which my wife's like, you're crazy. I kind of like, yeah, because I would need to kind of put myself in the role
They're
of,
all,
you know,
yeah,
I have special glasses for when I focus. Yeah.
yeah,
you have focus on
I
that
do.
help. But is that something you recognize? Because that, I think for a lot of people, that's sort of how you step into a
Mm.
kind of a role, and I'll give yourself permission, because I heard you said giving yourself permission.
yeah,
To me, it is also about giving me myself permission to be that, right? Now I am. Come on, you can, and I'm a guy, so I buy gear first of all, right? So I
yeah,
buy 20 cameras and lenses and stuff. So
yeah,
I don't know what that is, but it's a male. I think I don't know, it's only a male thing, but I think it's a male thing to kind of, it's insecurity, and it's like, it's like, first you hide yourself behind, no, I need to write, I need to write stuff, otherwise I can't do it, right? But it is sort of, I don't know, if you frame these things as in the sense of storytelling, and like you said, in circular stories, then it's not like, then also you go back and you go, nothing's ever lost, right? Because nothing's ever a waste of time. There's never been sort of like because it's circular, not a straight line. And if we think in straight lines, we get, we feel like we've lost things. We've lost, I should have done these things. And I've wasted all my time trying to be a photographer. And now I wanted to be a podcast host.
yeah, yeah. Because what you're saying is there,
you take on board everything, right? Through your stories, everything you ever do, whether even if it's like, your explorer kind of, like every corner, everything you've learned, every different thing you've done, in the end, you use all of that. But I think a lot of people are not aware of that. They're not aware of the fact that they've studied something completely different, and then they went and they had this experience there, and they had this odd job there, and then they are not aware, because they don't look back and see them as sort of circular stories, where then they actually take all that with them, and then that has built their. So I think, to me, that's such a powerful way of looking at your stories, your origin stories.
Yeah, it definitely. Well, for example, I have a friend who studied the Internet of Things, and he has a master's in the Internet of Things. What he does now is builds communities. And I said, and he's like, I wasted all this time like studying and getting. Actually, no, he's got a doctorate. He's got a doctorate in it. So he's like saying he wasted all this time. And I said, no, because you just studied how machines can talk to one another. But in fact, what you've got now is you're just getting humans to talk to each other. Mm-hmm. But probably a lot of the underlying principles are the same, like building connections between random things and people so that things happen, so that you're working together towards a greater purpose. And so it all completely makes sense. And he's interested in the Internet of Things still in an academic way, but not in a practitioner way. Like, he doesn't want to do that with his life. But if you think about, if we try to think about stuff as a straight line, then it's like this rapid segue where it's like it just juts down, and then you're in this other timeline. But in fact, there's parallel kind of, if we want to think it in straight terms, it's like there's parallel timelines running like, in conjunction with each other. But if it's a circular experience, then it's like intersecting loops that are like feedback into each other, maybe like a figure eight or an infinity kind of symbol. Or everything is just going out and coming back in. And I think the more we can get away from this very linear thinking, this Western style of linear straight lines, probably the more fulfilling most of your experiences will be, because you'll see it as cumulative, and you also be aware of the mystery of not knowing what the next loop is.
Because you
You don't-
didn't, so because it's about, people thinking kind of straight lines when they think about, for instance, their careers, they have this goal and they have to reach the goal. What if you didn't reach the goal? Then it's like unfulfilling when actually, what do you mean? It's not, that's obviously, and it's a bit a cliche, obviously, but it's about the journey and not the goal, right? But there's such a truth in that. If you just don't, if you go through, like my daughter, she's 16, almost 17, real teenager, hates school. And I was like, but she's just, she wants to get rid of school. That's all her goal is, kind of get that behind her, right? That's all. And then, but not being able to, enjoy or at least understand what you're experiencing in the moment. I know that's because you're a teenager, but if you are able to sit back and say, this is happening, that can be something bad. I mean, there's lots of bad things happening, in most people's lives at any given time. But you can also go like, it's something I'm experiencing. And so being able to have that moment of reflection or being a little bit, on another level, going like, hey, this is happening, instead of just wanting to get rid of things, get over it, and just don't realize it. Because I think that's such that's such an interesting thing if you think about that, the way you're talking about it, being sort of having this circular way of thinking about it instead of a linear, which make total sense, obviously, as creative people and designers, and because that's how we work. I don't know, that's really fascinating.
And it reminds me of this, like, it's probably not founded on psychology, but some Instagram armchair psychologists have this nice little post saying, if you keep finding yourself in the same situations, there's still a lesson there for you. And if you think about it like stories, right? Stories are meant to share it, to inspire us or to move us or impact us in some way. And if we keep coming across the same thing, it's also, there's this, and when you're talking about the figure 8 or something, I also had this really nice mental image of like a spiraling cyclone. So you start at the bottom, and then for the podcast listeners, I'm making movements with my hands, so I'm going to try to use my words. but you start at the bottom in this cycle, and it's just like a big coil, right? Like a coils upward into the cyclone or tornado funnel shape, and then it circles, but everything keeps just expanding and getting bigger, and everything beautiful and interesting and worth exploring and investigating falls, because it's still the circles, but they get bigger. And
yeah, now in my mind, I'm now seeing the cyclone sucking up homes and caravans and cows, and like, it's all part of my story, people.
Yeah.
Dorothy's
home is like spiraling over to Oz right now.
Yeah. Yes.
No place like home.
Yeah.
Okay, so Megan, I want to so because you're going to be an actor, apparently. That's your new.
He's an actor.
You are.
Yeah.
But that's your new kind of. That's what you're going to explore more of. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that something you're going to invest more time in? And
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yep. It's just the beginning. Definitely not going to stop doing it now that I've started again. I mean, it's a complete and total love affair. Like, as soon as I started doing it, I thought, why did I ever stop? Why did I stop? I don't know. I do know. I mean, part of it is, when you're starting a business, you're all in or you're out. There's no I kind of run a business. You run a business. So, I've been doing it for 11 years now. So the amount of brain space that I need to, deliver is not the same as it was, right? I don't need to come up with new products or the way that I format my projects. I understand exactly how much time it takes me, and I have a huge like story toolbox to take things from. So, the development time is different. So when you have 10 years of experience and someone says, what do you think? I know what I think because I've been doing it for 10 years. So it's like a very different experience once you reach a certain level of maturity with, with your career. And so, yeah, the storytelling stuff is 100% still going, but the acting is also 100% still going. So, yeah, so it's an interesting kind of turning point in my life. And yeah, I have a lot of friends that are like, oh, but like that's a big step to make. And I'm like, is it? I plan on living a lot longer. So I think.
Well, and as an actor, that's basically the last thing you'll do. So, right?
Yeah, you act until you literally can't get out of bed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's a good pension plan, really.
Yeah, diversifying my income streams. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is. Well, it's interesting. I think for a lot of, I think that's part of also, if you see yourself as a creative, that's it's not a job, right?
No.
And kind of, and then I think your canvas, whether that's acting or storytelling or a business, or at least in my experience, that doesn't really matter. So I think in that sense, is it a big transition? Why? Because you'll use your same kind of toolkit and your experience. You just grew until since when you acted before, you changed because you have so much more kind of experience and the stories basically in you, but you're still the same person. So it's kind of interesting in a way. You're circular kind of thinking that now you're back. You're going to be an actor again, but it changed because the context changed and your experience has changed. So it's really interesting to see what's happening is going to happen next.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm doing what I did when I was 12. I write stories all day and I act. Like I'm the same, but I'm obviously, a lot older now. But I mean, my point of view on these things have changed. My life experiences that I bring into it are vastly different. But I'm actually I've come full circle in that way. Come right back kind of where I started.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Next time we'll talk, she'll have talked to another nun again.
Yeah. Well, it's such a great example of a story. The nun story is such a great example of a story that kind of, if you share that story, it tells you tells everyone who's listening who you are and what you're about.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful example of a story where you go like, because I if I teach people about storytelling in business, I do also have them collect, or because that's a mental thing. That's a really difficult thing to do. You go like, collect stories, write them down that, communicate something about you, who you are, what you're about. And this is for leadership training. So if you want to communicate something, you want people to see you as a certain person. What is the story, that actually shows who you are?
Yeah.
What did you go through? What experience do you have? What could be bad, could be good, doesn't matter. But it's more like that. It should be a real story about you. And so I think that's such a, I don't know, that's so interesting in that sense. So stories like your story about the nun, that's exactly a story that people would like, that you'll never forget, because it's exactly, nobody will forget that story. You're like,
yeah.
That's right. It's funny. But it's also, you also know that it must have been, really frustrating also. And, there's, everything's there. So that's the start. And whenever, I don't know if you ever written that story, but that's a good story. That could be a good story to write.
Yeah, I have not. That's not one that I've written, but I've told it a number of times, like many times.
Yeah, of course, because it's such a powerful story about who you are, and it gives you the information right there.
Yeah.
The tiny little story.
Yeah. 5 minutes.
Questioning. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So thank you very much. I really enjoy. I could talk to you for another hour. But yeah, I really want to thank you, and we will. I hopefully talk again, and then you know, see how your acting career is going. And,
Yeah.
so it'll be really cool. So thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. And,
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to keep you updated on, on what happens next.
Yeah.
Excited to hear about it. Yeah, thanks for sharing.
My pleasure.